Wait, we are skipping forward. We are on dictionary-based analysis. So we've taken you through all of the typical steps for preparing a text set, a group of text for an analysis. We've worked through cleaning text, preparing text, creating a text object like a corpus or tidy text, and creating a document term matrix. And now we can finally start to look for patterns in text. And the most straightforward way to do this is through a dictionary-based approach. And a dictionary-based approach is one of the more, the earlier versions, things like earlier I mentioned Laswell counting utterances, right? And this is a case of word counting, right? And so here, we're simply making the assumption that we, the researchers, know what words mean. And if we find, we can develop a list of words that we think are associated with some theme or topic we care about. Could be things like whether or not a group of texts have negative sentiment in them, right? We might come up with a list of words that we think convey or a negative sentiment. And so basically, we're then just going to write code that goes through our text, counts the appearances of those words, and make visualizations. So let's check it out with our Trump tweet data frame. Once again, we're loading that from my GitHub site here. We're going to use tidy text and dplyr. And we are creating tidy text from those Trump tweets. We're also going to drop stop words like we did in a previous step. We are also going to drop, using a grep command, https, t.co, AMP, and RT, and these are all artifacts of the links and the proprietary link structure that Twitter uses. And again, if you're new to dplyr, if you're new to piping, a lot of stuff up here is going on that's going to seem a little strange. But essentially, remember, each line, when we see a pipe, is passing whatever was produced on this line to the next line. And both objects and functions and instructions are being passed, and that makes it especially difficult to follow. But essentially, first we're taking out stop words, then we're taking out these additional terms that we don't think are going to convey much meaning in our analysis. And then we're producing a new data frame that just simply includes the top 20 words that appear in this corpus of Trump tweets that was collected about a month ago in 2018. And so one thing we very well may want to do is plot these, look at some basic descriptives around which terms are appearing more than others. Here's some ggplot. We're taking the object we just produced in the previous step called top 20, which is top 20 Trump terms that appear in the most tweets. We're just making a bar graph. And we've got some aesthetic elements here specifying how we want the background of the plot to look, what the title is, whether we want a legend, and so on and so forth. And if you're new to ggplot, there's great documentation online. It's one of the real strengths of our, again, part of the tidyverse. And here's what we might find from a very simple text analysis, right? What are some of the most common words? American, you can't read this, but if you're zooming in, border, country, day, Democrats, fake, honor, house, jobs, media, military, news, people, and so on, right? That sounds pretty familiar. That sounds like we're finally on to some signal after. Think of all the steps we had to take to get here, though, working through all the pre-processing and coding and data restructuring steps. All right? One thing we often want to do at this stage is not only identify common words, but create metrics that allow us to reward or weight the appearance of unusual words. And one way we very often do that is to calculate a metric called the term frequency inverse document frequency. And this is very often abbreviated as TF-IDF. And all we're doing here is taking a corpus, and we've got a given term, and we want to calculate this metric IDF, inverse document frequency. and we've got a number of documents, and then we've got the document frequency of that term, and we're just taking the log of that. And so if we have high inverse document frequency, we've got a weird word, and low inverse document frequency, we've got a common word. Why might we want to do this? Well, let's look back at our terms here, right? We have terms like America, and let's say we weren't just wanting to analyze Trump tweets, but let's say we're looking at all elected officials, right? Probably most of our elected officials are going to mention America a lot, right? Or maybe they'll mention Twitter a lot, or something like that, right? And it really doesn't convey much meaning to us in an analysis, and so we maybe want to penalize it. We maybe want to make it less. We want it to carry less influence when we do our classification. And so I'm briefly just showing you this because we're going to use it in subsequent techniques like topic modeling and like text networks. Okay. So if we want to calculate the term frequency inverse document frequency in tidy text, we can use code like this. Once again, we're starting from the Trump tweets object, so that we've done a few of these steps in previous slides. This unnest tokens function is transforming that data frame that we pulled from Twitter into tidy text, where each line is a word. Here we're removing stop words. Here we're counting words by their frequency, which we need to do to calculate the term frequency inverse document frequency. And then here we've got a function called bind tf-idf that is going to create for each word the term frequency inverse document frequency. And we can use that to kind of try to figure out what's the most powerful, weird word. That's one way of thinking about this, right? And lo and behold, what's the most powerful weird word? Stand for our anthem, right? And that actually is kind of, that is a very telling word. This refers to for those of you who don't know, the debate about American football players kneeling during the national anthem, where it's customary for people to stand. And of course, this provoked a virulent political debate about the rights of athletes to engage in political protest. But it was something that was very characteristic of the Trump narrative and platform at the time. Okay, so term frequency inverse document frequencies and regular word frequencies are, can be pretty meaningful after we've removed stop words and pre-processed our text. But very often we don't just want to count words by their frequency. Again, we have some kind of knowledge about a theory, and we want to then develop our own list of words to track in a corpus. And there are a variety of kind of off-the-shelf methods, R packages, standalone software that will perform dictionary-based analyses for you based on other people's dictionaries or lexicons. These are groups of words that people think are associated with some type of theme. But you may also want to create your own. And so let's do a quick little toy example here. Let's say we wanted to count the frequency of terms about the economy and in these Trump tweets that we've been looking at. And here we have a list of completely arbitrary economic terms that I came up with: economy, unemployment, trade, tariffs. And all we're doing here is we're creating a character vector, or string vector of characters. And we're then going to use another package popular for string management or string manipulation called stringer in R. Earlier I mentioned that R used to kind of lag behind Python and kind of basic text preprocessing. So if you're coming to R from Python, there's a lot of new packages such as stringer, such as tidy text, such as QDAP, which have a variety of really useful functions for core kind of text cleaning techniques. We're going to use stringer, a function called string detect, to subset our Trump tweets. And here we're moving back into base R convention instead of dplyr in order to produce a new list of documents within our corpus that have mentioned these economic terms. And so first we create that object, and then we browse that object The variable in that object that contains the tweets is called text. We're looking at the first two of them. And we can see here that both of these texts, right, are about the economy to some extent, right? Here's our term economy, which got picked up. And here's trade down here, right? So, not bad. We could do some meaningful analysis with this simple strategy. We would want to get much more sophisticated and systematic about how we identified terms about the economy. We'd want to have a much longer list. But assuming that we could make the assumption, and this is an important point, that each word has one and only one meaning, then we can do a lot with a dictionary-based approach. A key problem, as you may already kind of anticipate, is very often single words not only have multiple meanings, but assume those different meanings based upon their co-occurrence with other words. And so what we'll see as we get into things like topic modeling is we're going to drop the assumption that each term, bless you, has only one meaning, and instead we're going to allow terms to carry, to assume different meaning when they co-appear with other terms. But for now, most people who get into the field of quantitative text analysis at one point or another need to do some kind of dictionary-based approach, and this is a very simple example. Another very popular form of dictionary-based text analysis today is sentiment analysis. So many of you have probably heard of this type of thing, right? We can track the valence of a text. So very often we don't care just about whether or not a text is about a theme, but whether that theme is being discussed negatively or positively, and so on and so forth. And so in sentiment analysis, we typically come up with a lexicon, a list of words that we think carry positive meaning and negative meaning. We then, in some way, assign a numerical score. Maybe negative scores are going to be negative words and positive scores are going to be positive scores. Or maybe we count the number of words. But in some way, we're counting word frequency in order to extract the sentiment of a text. And there's a lot of different sentiment analysis tools, most of which are not very great. Why? Again, because we assume that each word has one and only one meaning. So that I'd hate to be the president, I hate the president, right? Vastly different meanings. Both are using the term hate. In 99.9% of sentiment classifiers, that hate is going to be counted as a negative word, and hate president is going to come out, right? So as you can see, that's not always a great assumption, but it's not a completely unmeaningful assumption either, especially if at scale. Usually when people use the term hate, it conveys negative value. And so here we're looking at, from the tidy text package, we are looking at words as they've been scored by the AFIN sentiment analysis tool. Tidytext has a number of sentiment classifiers built in. There are dozens and dozens. In a few minutes, I'll show you some comparison of them and how they score things differently and how they vary. And we'll talk a little bit about how to choose the right one. But before we do that, let's try to classify some of our Trump tweets according to their sentiment. And this time, we're going to use a slightly different sentiment dictionary. This one is created by Bing Liu, who's a information scientist. Importantly, this classifier was trained on Yelp data and other review data. And many of the most popular sentiment classifiers are trained on those data sets. And so when we apply this data set to something other than reviews, we're making the assumption that when people talk about, say, an Amazon product, they use the same type of language when they're talking about politics or something like that. Is that a reasonable assumption? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? But in many cases, we would love to have a corpus-specific sentiment analysis tool. And certainly as we move into other languages besides English, then one needs to, of course, have different sentiment dictionaries. So here we see our sentiment classifier applied to the Trump corpus, and the Bing classifier will assign either a positive or a negative score, a binary kind of decision. And it will then aggregate those using this code here, this count here, which is part of dplyr, of course. And so what we're seeing here is we've counted the sentiment of tweets by day, or sorry, by time here, and looked at how many positive or negative words were in each tweet. And now you may remember yesterday, or if you were watching yesterday, the lecture on collecting digital trace data, I mentioned that date data is a bit of a pain, right? Because of time zones and because people represent dates in different ways, right? Some people might abbreviate the month, other people might use numbers for a month. And because we all talk about times in different ways, not only because of time zones, but also because of just how we describe time, whether or not we include the year or not when we do a timestamp, we need to find a way of putting all our date objects, or our date representations of dates, into the same format. This code here is an example of how to do that. This es.date function reads in a character string, and here I'm specifying where the year is, where the month is, where the day is, and that there's dashes in between them. And then this X here describes a universal kind of time stamp that's very commonly featured in especially social media data, but a lot of data sets, a lot of time formats, that is. And we could have also created Unix time or something like that, which again is the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st, 1970. We want to probably keep the date, though, if we want to do things like visualize it, right? So let's say, for example, we want to count the number of Trump tweets with negative sentiment by day. And so here again, we've taken our tidy Trump tweets. We've run the Bing classifier on them. We've dropped all positive tweets. And then we've counted the number of negative tweets by day. And then once again, we use some ggplotting. Here we would produce the following graph that shows the frequency of tweets with negative sentiment over time. So here we're looking at April 2017 all the way up to April 2018. And on the y-axis, again, is frequency of negative words in Trump's tweets. And whether we see a trend there or not depends on, probably a lot of things. Maybe there's a slight upward trend, let's say. By the way, if you applied a different sentiment classifier to the same tweets, you might be interested to see how much they can vary. And that's because, sentiment dictionaries are often trained or calibrated using different data sets. So one trained on Yelp might produce something very different than one trained on all words in the English dictionary, when we'll look at one of those in just a second. Keep that in mind. Now let's say we wanted to get cute about this and do some kind of analysis to compare sentiment with approval rating. And this is just to kind of try to mash up some of the skills we've been learning yesterday with today. Let's read in some data from the polling site 538 here. And let's say this is the overall approval rating of Trump by day. We're doing a lot of work to clean up the data and plot it, restructure it, ggplot it here. And then we need to standardize our date format. But if we're being very uncareful social scientists, we might infer when we look at if we notice that this is April here, if we are seeing an increase in negative sentiment, that begins somewhere around here with, correlation is not causation, huge caveat here. But, and this is, by the way, that's the type of uncareful analysis that has led many people outside our field to caricaturize our field. And so, this is an example of where we would want to know much more about what's going on in the world. And even then, we probably wouldn't be content to say that the sentiment of presidential speech determines approval ratings, right? I put this in here partly because we're going to use these data in our group exercise today to try to maybe come up with a somewhat more sophisticated answer to that question. Okay, so there's many different dictionary-based approaches. And one that's become very popular in our field, it was used in, for example, the emotional contagion experiment, and many other studies, is called linguistic inquiry word count. And the idea here was to say, rather than finding a single set of meanings, say around sentiment, and then looking in particular corpuses and coming up with a list of words, let's look at all of the words, and let's classify each word. And this was done in a fairly systematic process. James Pennebaker is a social psychologist at Texas, has been at this for about 30 years. And he not only had large groups of coders go over the entire English dictionary, so this is an English-only approach or technique, but in a variety of different corpuses like newspaper articles. Now they're looking at Twitter and so on. But it also has some external validity insofar as they validated their coding of words by through some pseudo-experimental studies. So, for example, they might prime people in a laboratory to write about something that makes them sad, and then count the frequency of words in that, and then use that to weight their classifiers and give a certain weight for the word sad in the category for certain words like melancholy in the category sad or sadness. And so the neat thing about it is it measures quite a few things. It measures things not so interesting, things maybe like verb tense and that kind of stuff. But also here we have cognitive processes, negative emotion, causal language, tentative language, certainty, inclusive versus exclusive language. These are some things a social scientist could care about, especially if you're interested in social psychology, right? There is some systematic work that's been done here to try to validate this dictionary. And it's one of the more well-validated and well-understood dictionary-based approaches. And it's been used across many, many studies in many, many different fields. But once again, it's making the assumption that a word has a single weight towards a single theme. And very often, we can't make that assumption. Or very often, we want to look at a theme that's not listed here, right? Let's say we care about politics, and we want to identify tweets about politics, and there's no theme for politics here, right? So then we're out of luck, right? We're kind of beholden to whatever this team of researchers thought was an important category to measure. Right? There is a trade-off, though, right? On the one hand, when we move into unsupervised text analysis, we're actually going to ask algorithms to do this classification for us, right? And algorithms, aren't smart. They are just going to find patterns, right? And it is meaningful that people understand meaning, right? And so one can make an argument that dictionary-based approaches in some settings for certain types of research projects are a much more reasonable approach than, say, topic modeling, because we know something about what we're out to measure, But as I mentioned earlier, there's many different sentiment analysis techniques. They've very often been trained on very different corpuses in very different ways. And that means that they perform with more or less accuracy on different types of texts. So here, for example, we have data sets from Twitter, MySpace, the BBC, YouTube, and so on. And then we have a ground truth measurement of positive minus negative sentiment in each corpus. And that's that dashed red line here. That's like what these scores should actually be measuring according to this study, which I think I have linked in the markdown. And what you're seeing here is a lot of different sentiment classifiers. Here's linguistic inquiry word count, this blue one here. And then this green one here, which is doing really well, is called PANAS-T. And some of them, you'll also note that some of them are doing better for different types of corpuses, right? Why? Because, well, let's say a classifier that's trained on Yelp data might be picking up YouTube discourse much better because there's like more internet speak, right? Or abbreviations, LOL or something like that, which may not be captured in some of these other techniques. So long story short, with dictionary-based analysis, there are certainly cases where it can be a very, very suitable method, especially when the classifier can be well tied to a theory or to, for example, a psychological process. And there, something like linguistic inquiry word count, to the extent it's been validated in a variety of settings, even in some more experimental field settings, if you're interested in reading about that, then it's not an unreasonable choice. Okay. But very often, again, we can't make strong assumptions about what is going into our, we don't have a lot of knowledge about what's going on in our corpus, and we want some help. We want some help navigating particularly very large corpuses, right? And before we start in these unsupervised approaches, we should think what we're asking an algorithm to do, right? We're in some sense asking it to do our work for us, right? If you've ever done a cluster analysis or a factor analysis on a data set like the document term matrix that we created earlier today, you'll know that you always pick up a pattern, right? These pattern identification approaches are meant to pick up patterns, right? And so there's a real temptation to say, well, there's algorithms that are really good at this. But having spent 10 or more years working in this field, I can tell you that I've never discovered an algorithm that's as good at classifying text as a human. And why? That's because when you think about the, again, natural language usage, the ways that words can take on different meanings in different contexts, different people, when they're written by different people at different stages in time, there are going to be tools that help us kind of work through that. But at root, there's no replacement for a human classification. And that's really, I think, not welcome news to a lot of people coming to this field who think, I've got a huge corpus, I want to analyze it, and I'm here to learn how to avoid reading a lot, right? Again, David Blay, the pioneer of topic modeling, and his colleague David Mimno, like to describe topic modeling as tools for reading. Right? They are not ways of measuring meaning in text in and of themselves. They need to be validated. They need to be interpreted very carefully. So just before we get into that, I just want to set in context what we're doing. We're asking a computer to make sense of ones and zeros, right? Computer doesn't have the kind of fine-grained intuition about how many of the examples I gave earlier about these kind of vagaries of natural language usage might change the meaning of a text. Instead, the bet is, again, at scale. If we have large amounts of data, we can start learning to detect patterns. Then we're going to do OK. That's the bet. OK, so what is topic modeling? Topic modeling is a kind of family of approaches that you can think of in a very primitive way as a kind of cluster analysis on words. And indeed, many of the early variants of topic modeling were essentially just that, either a cluster analysis or a kind of latent class analysis, some pattern identification approach applied to our document term matrix, or some other matrix representation of a corpus. Somewhere in the 1990s, the latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA method, became popular. And this is a model that is going to essentially, in an iterative process, using Bayesian techniques, take a corpus, read in a corpus, or more specifically, our document term matrix. And from that, it's going to read in documents, look for patterns of co-occurrence in words, and then make guesses about a set of themes that are pre-specified by the researcher. So we might say we have 20 topics in our corpus, and given that input and a set of documents, the classifier will pass through each document. At first, it's going to randomly assign each document a probability of belonging to one of the, say, 20 topics that we've assigned it to, completely randomly. Actually, it's a Dirichlet process for those of you who are math geeks, but it's more or less a random process or similar to it. And then what we're going to do is each time we pass through, we're going to use something like naive Bayes classifier to improve the, our classification of the probability that each document belongs to one of these hypothetical 20 topics that we think might exist in our document. And then at the end of the day, we're going to get out an output from this analysis that says something like, you know, a given document has a probability of belonging to topic number 1 that is 0.98 or something like that. That's one of the outputs. The other outputs we'll get is something like a list of words that most commonly appear for each topic. So that was all a pretty abstract discussion. Let's try and make it a little more concrete from a nice paper by David Blay that's less of a technical introduction to topic modeling and more of a high, you know, a lay audience introduction. In this paper in the Journal of Machine Learning in 1998, I think it was, you'll see an application of latent Dirichlet allocation to abstracts in the journal Science over 100 years. And the idea was that could an algorithm be trained to classify the discipline of the author or the content of the article more specifically, given enough training data, given enough input, right? And so we have a huge corpus of abstracts from the journal Science. And here's an example of one of them. Actually, I think this is the full text of the article. And what we're seeing is an article about Cold Spring Harbor. Very appropriately, this might be the Cold Spring Harbor of computational social science if we're being a little reaching. But let's say, so Cold Spring Harbor, for those of you who don't know, is kind of an institute like this to bring together people around cancer research. So in this article, across disciplines, in this article you'll see there's a lot of different words about genetics and biology and also computational stuff. And so what you're seeing if you're zooming in on your screen here is this is a visual depiction of how the topic model is working. So different words have different colors in our document here, which are assigned, which are affiliated here with different topics. So for example, here we're making a very silly assumption, which is that there's only 4 topics in the whole corpus. And we haven't labeled them, right? The topic model doesn't actually label the topics for you. That's the job of the researcher, and that's part of the validation step that's vital. But here, if we look at these terms, here we've got gene, DNA, genetic, life, evolve, organism, brain, neuron, nerve. You know, we could maybe say, okay, well, this one's really about neurology, this one's about biology, and this one's about genetics, and this one's about computers, right? And you'll see that each of these words has a given probability of being associated with the topic, and each document has a probability of being associated with each topic. And so what you're seeing here is just a visual representation of how different words are being associated with different topics. Now the question is very often asked, okay, so how is this different than a cluster analysis? In a typical kind of hard cluster analysis, right, we're making the assumption that each document can belong to one and only one cluster, or in our case, maybe we'd call that a topic or a theme in a text. Here, latent Dirichlet allocation and many extensions thereof are assuming it's a mixture model. So words can belong to multiple topics, documents can belong to multiple topics. And that means that we have a more probabilistic approach of classification and allow for the effect. We relax that assumption that I was mentioning earlier that each word has one and only one meaning, and instead we make an assumption about a bag of words. We're saying we're taking a document, we're jumbling all the words together, throwing them in a bag, and looking at patterns of co-occurrence in those words within documents, and using that to improve our ability to make predictions about the probability that a latent theme or topic exists in one document versus another. But in principle, every single document is going to have some probability of being affiliated with every single theme. And so very often the researcher will have to make some kind of arbitrary decision about what that cutoff point is, that the probability really means that the topic exists in the model. Okay, so again, we've assumed here that we know the number of topics that is in the corpus. And when you think about it, this is kind of a catch-22, right? We want to use these unsupervised approaches precisely because we don't know enough about the topics. We can't read them all, right? At the same time, one of the required inputs of the model is the number of topics we expect to find. So if I tell you, how many topics do we expect to find in our Trump tweets corpus? I don't know. I have no idea, right? Is it 10? Is it 20? Is it 200? What is a topic, right? Those are all questions that need to be answered early and often, right? Because we will find, if we run an LDA analysis in our corpus, we will find 2 topics, 20 topics, 200 topics, right? And so part of our job when we do topic modeling is to learn how to validate and make assumptions. And typically, in the best practice in the field has become, and this is again why the analogy, a tool for reading, has become important, is that what we're really doing is detecting some patterns, then validating them using our own human knowledge, and then optimizing the classification, making better assumptions about the number of topics, and then rerunning the topic model again and again and again. There are going to be ways, as we'll see, to use some sort of goodness of fit measures to try to help us do that. But knowing personally the authors of these goodness of fit measures, I can tell you that they would tell you that you shouldn't just naively use these. These are at the end, nowhere near as good as human intelligence. Yep? Okay, so we're going to run our first topic model here using a very clean data set. We'll work through a messier data set in a second, and I'll explain why we're jumping around a little bit here. We're beginning with a very simple kind of topic modeling. This is just vanilla LDA. Now there's many variants of topic modeling. I tend to encourage people to use the structural topic modeling package for most topic modeling if you're working in R. We're doing an example with an earlier package called topic models. I tend to encourage people to use the structural topic modeling package because not only because it has this feature that we'll talk about in just a second, which is the ability to use metadata to improve topic classification, but also just simply because it's much easier to use. All those steps of prepping text that we did earlier in sequential form can be done in one line of code in structural topic modeling, for example. And so let's work through an example just so you have it in your toolkit, but we're going to go a little bit quick so that we can get to structural topic modeling, which I think, again, will be more useful to most people. So we're loading the topic models package. We're loading a data set in there called Associated Press. This is a very common corpus of news articles produced by the American Associated Press organization and the very popular data set in the natural language processing community. Earlier, I told you that it's really easy to teach you with a clean example. If you browse this data, you'll see it's very clean. We have no character encoding issues. We don't have any strange patterns in the text. It's very well curated. So this is, in a sense, we've skipped the hard part. And here's how we might run a topic model. So we take our corpus, or our data here. We're applying a function called LDA, just for latent Dirichlet allocation. And here's the very important parameter K. That's the number of topics that we expect to find in this corpus. I'm making the completely arbitrary and probably ridiculous assumption that there are 10 topics in this very large corpus of news articles. There might be 700. I have no idea, right? But just for the purposes of illustration, we're going to say there's 10. And importantly, I've set a seed here. This is for the purposes of replication. So because LDA will begin with a random assignment of probabilities of documents belonging to topics, if we want to reproduce that, we need to set the random number or the seed that's going to use to make that randomization. Structural topic modeling, a nice feature is it uses something called spherical initialization. And so that will relieve us of this obligation. But here, just for reproducibility's sake, we want to set the seed. And you can set other control parameters in the LDA. For example, so this is an iterative approach, right? Each time we pass through the entire corpus with our naive Bayes classifier, we're going to make predictions. And at a certain point, those predictions are going to change less and less. And then we're going to consider that the model has converged. but we can specify different numbers of iterations that we want to wait until the model converges. And so, by default, I think it's something like 35 or something like that, but you could specify more or less. There's no real good reason why it's 35 that I know of, but there you have it. Okay, so now that we've run our first topic model, this, depending on your machine, it might take a few minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes to run if you had an older machine. You would, by the way, if you have a large corpus, a very large corpus, topic modeling can take a very long time to run. One limitation of topic modeling is because it's an iterative approach, where each time we pass through and classify, make better and better guesses about which document belongs to which topic, it depends on the previous iteration, right? We have to compare the current iteration to the previous iteration. And so the code can't easily be parallelized or run on multiple CPUs, and then which speeds up most coding immeasurably, right? Or not immeasurably, but a lot. And so very often we take a long time, we wait a long time for topic models to run. One possible solution to this issue is to run a cloud server version of RStudio or whatever you use, Jupyter Notebooks if you're in Python or something like that. There's a link in the tutorial from yesterday has a link about running RStudio in the Amazon EC2 environment. And there, you wouldn't want to just throw a big computer at it because it's really it's not necessarily a memory or CPU issue, but you could open many, many instances of RStudio and run many, many models at the same time. That's one way to potentially speed up your process. And why might you care about time? Well, remember, if we're in the world where we are saying that there are, just a few, we don't know what the number of topics are, we're likely going to have to do a number of initial runs in order to figure out what the best, which range of topics is closest to where we want to be. Yeah, Carson.
Hey, can you elaborate a little bit on the trade-off between like time you need for fitting the model and vocabulary size?
Sure.
My experience is usually a lot of words occur so rarely that you would cut them off.
Sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So Karsten here at Duke has mentioned that it's commonplace to remove both very common words and very uncommon words from the corpus before running a topic model. The idea being that those words are going to have very little influence on the overall classification, right? A word that appears everywhere, like earlier we were talking about America in a corpus of tweets by American politicians, right? Unlikely to mean much because everybody's going to say America, probably, maybe not. Or a really, really strange word that never appears, right? It's hard for the algorithm to learn about that because it's like, oh, well, that only occurred in these 3 documents, and so what is it? Where does it belong? I can't make a good guess about where it belongs, right? And that takes, that as Carson is suggesting, it takes longer for models to converge when there's these both very popular words, which are hard to figure out where they belong because they appear so often, and very rare words because they appear so infrequently. Yeah, and by default, again, I'm trying to get us to the structural topic modeling because it's going to do that by default, which is a nice feature, although we can shut that off if we want. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've run our topic model. We created an object called AP topic model. We want to plot the betas. These are the probability assignments of words to topics. We're going to use ggplot and dplyr to both produce a list of top terms by topic, and then here to plot it. Yeah? Okay, so here we have the results of our first topic model. We have 10 topics. And earlier I mentioned that was a totally arbitrary assumption, right? But let's take a look at some of them. This first one here says the top words are million, percent, billion, market, year, stock, prices, company. Okay, that sounds like economics or stocks or something. The second one says Soviet states, United, West, East, President, German, Union, Germany. Maybe Soviet sphere of influence in Western Germany, but maybe Soviet Union, maybe Germany, I don't know. United Iraq military air, that sounds pretty good. Kuwait, American, maybe that's the first Gulf War. But then, if we come down to like topic 7, people new don't think school just going years time. You know, what is that? That is a bad topic. That is why this issue of naively assigning topics is a problem, right? We chose 10 kind of naively just so that we could neatly visualize this. Probably a better thing, you know, I don't know, might have started out at 200 or something like that, right? But there we can have the opposite problem, right? That when we have too many topics, we can essentially be, you know, predicting one document because we're just saying there's, you know, a lot of different ways to categorize the documents, right? We're going to look at some tools in just a second that help us make this choice in a less arbitrary way. But this illustration is just to show you that, you know, garbage in, garbage out, right? If we didn't make a good guess, we're going to get a nonsensical result. Some of them are not bad, right, given that we made this silly choice. But that's probably because the words United, Iraq, and military came up. And United was probably, by the way, United States parsed accidentally because of this earlier issue that Natalie brought up about, you know, like compound nouns or noun phrases being severed by the tokenization of words at the word level. Yeah, tokenization of text at the word level. Yeah. Any other questions so far? Yeah, yeah, Martin.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more about, you know, best practices of interpreting these topics.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's just so many ways of going about doing this, and I'm wondering what you would consider convincing or less convincing.
Absolutely. If I may, I'm going to kind of wait to answer the question until we get into structural topic modeling, because there's going to be 3 or 4 functions that are really useful for precisely that process. But the short answer is, you know, validate, read, you know, in an iterative process. Visualization can also be extremely useful in looking at the topic. Something like the LDA to Viz package, LDA Viz package, sorry, is a neat kind of interactive JavaScript representation of a topic model where one can plot the distribution of topics in, say, principal component space to look at patterns of similarities in the assignment of words to topics, and then mouse over certain topics, which are here represented as nodes, in order to reveal the most common words associated with it and things like that. So that's a nice type of resource. There's others that work specifically with the structural topic model that we will soon look at as well. But that kind of back and forth, the ability to see the forest for the trees, as we like to say, is a really useful tool. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I have a question to what you just mentioned earlier. Is there a way and approach to detect compound phrases?
Yes.
Because it may be like necessary, especially when you work with foreign language texts,
yes,
which you have no idea about.
Yes. So there's a few different options. The one that we've in my lab group have become most enamored of is called UDPipe. It's a relatively newer R package. There's also one called Phrase Machine, which was written by Hannah Wallach, who's one of David Minmo's students, or no, David Blaze's students. I think I'm getting messed up here. But she's very active in writing the code for the topic modeling world. We've also used that. It's a bit more complicated to use, has typically some Java issues, unless you install a Python backend for the parser called Spacey. Maybe in the Slack, Frito could share some information about that. But essentially, these are R packages when applied to a text that will produce, instead of words, they will extract noun phrases or noun compounds from the text, which you could then pass into your topic model or to your document term matrix.
Just a follow-up question, but ideologically, do you think we should always try to look for compound phrases, like when we do this? I mean,
it's a good question. You know, we'll look at, when we get into, so I don't know of a comparison, maybe someone else does, in the world of topic modeling. When we get to text networks, one of the functions will allow you to tokenize by either all parts of speech, really. So one could do that comparison. there is a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Alice Rule and Jean-Philippe Conté and Peter Bierman that suggests that noun phrases are indeed the most informative if we're out to identify the topical focus of a corpus. But it's hardly the authoritative statement on the issue. I think most people simply ignore noun phrases. Yeah.
Argument. It feels like that sometimes phrases may contain more than 2 words, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it might be like 3.
So the phrase machine package, for example, has a parameter called n-gram length, which would allow you to vary the length of the sequence of words that would be picked up by the noun, by the phrase.
But then there may be order, yes? Because in some languages the phrase can be like,
Right.
have
So
like
all
different order.
All of these are language specific. So they depend upon a tool called a part-of-speech tagger, which have to be trained in different languages. The UD pipe library that I mentioned earlier works with various languages. And I don't know, Frito, do you happen to know whether Russian is one of them? We don't know, but at least it's in a few other major languages. So this is something people think about and care about, but it's again, like so many other fields, dominated by the English-speaking world, and there is good work being done, but it's not yet widely available, except in the UD pipe package that I know. I believe the Stanford parser, which is one of the more popular tools in natural language processing, works with a number of different languages as well. I know it works with a number of different languages, but I'm just not sure whether it would do part-of-speech tagging in Russian. We'd have to look it up. Yeah. Any other questions? Or it does. UD pipe has Russian. Okay, good. All right. Sorry, I can't quite. The people on the live stream can't quite hear you.
Not with the language you know, but the largest problem is the language which you actually don't know. Like
Sure.
When I was doing Arabic, for example. So
Yeah.
that's where you start worrying what you are doing.
Yeah, I think doing topic modeling in another language, actually we have an expert on that here who's going to give a topic, maybe give a flash talk next week about that. Those of you on the live stream, we can maybe Slack you the paper, but uses Google Translate to look at some of those issues of translation. And so we should probably move on because it's a bit of a narrow topic, but we should connect on Slack about that. Yeah. And those of you who are, maybe on Slack, people could also share language-specific tools other than UD pipe. Okay? Any questions from the live stream? Well, as long as we're taking questions. No. Oh, yeah. Okay. So we should keep moving. We have an exercise in here in case you want to practice. Remember, though, that really there's a real danger of reading tea leaves, right? Meaning, this practice of you drink a cup of tea and then you look at how the tea leaves are arranged at the bottom, and then you extract some meaning of that probably random assortment of tea leaves at the bottom of the cup, right? This is a ritual practice. That's kind of what we're doing when we do topic modeling very often, right? I think I see a face, or I think I see a smiley face, right? That's basically what we're doing. This is an analogy that was drawn by a data scientist who was at Facebook some years ago named Jonathan Chang, which I think is very nice. Okay, so that's kind of regular LDA. We're now going to move into structural topic modeling. This is the visualization that shows the architecture of the STM package written by Brendan Stewart, who spoke at the Institute last year, gave a great lecture on the STM package and some new extensions thereof around causal inference and text analysis that you can watch on the archive from last year. So it's our website, but 2017 at the end of the URL instead of 2018. Basically, it's a package that does everything from reading in text, pre-processing it, running an arguably better kind of topic model, then tools to evaluate it, and this gets the earlier question about validation, to help label and understand which type of thematic themes or words or groups of words are driving things, and then to visualize. Often to visualize the prevalence of topics according to metadata like time or author, but also interactive visualizations. They, again, let us move back and forth and see to what extent metadata are driving classification, or just more broadly to help us validate the topic model. Okay. We're going to work with the same example that Brandon uses in his vignette. It's co-authored with Molly Roberts and Dustin Tingley. This I hosted on a Google Drive for y'all. We're going to create a data frame called polyblogs. This is the messy example that I mentioned earlier. So this is from, I think, 2008. It's a database of political blogs. It's about, I think, 3,000 of them from about, I think, 4 or 5 blogs. And if you browse the data a little bit, you'll see that there's a column that describes the text, so the text of the blog post. Then there's the day of 2008 in which it occurred. So you might see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then there's the name of the blog. And then there's a code that was manually assigned by a coder that says whether or not the blog was conservative or liberal. Okay, that's obviously somewhat of a crude classification, but we're going to exploit that for illustrative purposes. Okay, so here we're creating an object called polyblogs. Next, we're going to load the STM package. We're going to use one of its core functions called text processor to read in the data, which is stored. The documents are in a variable called documents. And we also importantly need to distinguish or tell this function where the metadata live. These are the things like the day in which the post was produced, the blog on which it produced, and whether it was this liberal or conservative blog. Next, we're going to use a function called prep documents, which does most or all of the previous text preprocessing steps, like stemming, like removing white spaces, like removing numbers and punctuation. It's also going to remove, as we were discussing earlier, both very common words and both very rare words. One thing that's a little bit funky about the package is we have to specify these other objects that describe where the metadata are, where the documents themselves are, or that are the documents themselves, and then also a vocab, which is the list of words that ever appear in any text. And this is what the code actually looks like. We are running the STM function. We are specifying where the documents are that we want to run these on. We created this out object in a previous step. Here we're specifying where the vocabulary is, or the number, all the unique words. Here we're once again very naively assuming that there are 10 topics in this corpus. And here's a really important line. This is specifying how we want to use the metadata. So you can think of this almost like a regression model. So if you're familiar with a regression model in R, the thing on the left side is the outcome, and then this tilde means differentiates the dependent variable from the independent variables. And so here you can think of this as saying the prevalence of topics should be influenced by the rating, and that's the variable that describes whether the blog is liberal or conservative, and the day variable, and we've applied a smoother to that day variable. Here's some other parameters like the maximum number of iterations, this different type of initialization instead of random number generator, the spectral initialization, and then we've asked it not to spit out too much text in our R console. And so when we run that, and that would take some time to run, at least a few minutes depending on your machine, we can then start to plot some of the output in ways that are similar to what we did in ggplot earlier. This plot is kind of nice. It's simply topic proportions on the x-axis here. And then we have the different topics. And this is the most prevalent topic. Again, one that doesn't make much sense, like one think. But this second one sure does. Obama campaign will, yes we will, or yes we can, right? Will tax American, McCain, Palin, John. Again, we have a mix of some that seem quite meaningful and others that maybe do not. And a lot of these blog posts are about the presidential election and things like that. But this is a really neat way of looking at the prevalence of topics across the whole corpus. the prevalence of words within each topic. And so this is a useful validation tool. We clearly know after looking at this that 10 was a bad choice, right? That there's probably many more than 10 topics in this corpus. Next, in getting back to the interpretation thing, a question asked earlier about interpretation, this is a nice function that allows us to find passages of text that exemplify the topic that's been assigned to it. So again, we've got a kind of a weird, we've got a messy model here because we just naively assigned 10 topics, but if we were trying to validate what's going on with maybe some of these more problematic topics, we can ask here for 2 exemplary passages of topic number 3, and we would output, and it's in the markdown, it's not on these slides, you'd see some passages from the blog posts that are meant to exemplify that topic. And if you're seeing nonsense, again, it's garbage in, garbage out. It means you need to rethink your initial decision about the number of topics, or maybe something about the way you pre-process data that might be driving your results. Another extremely useful function from the STM package is a function called search K. And here we can, again, specify a topic model. It looks very much similar to the STM package, except here, instead of specifying a single value of K, here we have specified 2 values, 10 and 30, but we could also write 10:30, and then this function would produce topic models for every value of K between 10 and 30. And usefully, it also outputs several goodness of fit measures, known as, or called semantic coherence, topic exclusivity, the log likelihood, and one other that's escaping me right now. And then you can plot those. And so depending on the metric, you're trying to either minimize or maximize the metric. And what's useful about this is you'll get a plot with these 4 different goodness of fit measures. And in most cases, or at least in my experience, they will produce different optimization points, but they might give you a range of values within which you might validate your topic model in a more qualitative, iterative manner. So for example, if all 4 of the goodness of fit measures suggest that the optimal value of K is probably between 20 and 25, you could then run those 5 models, go into them, use tools like the Find Thoughts tool or some of the other visualization tools I'll discuss in just a minute to try to further validate them. Yeah? Okay. Now, the other neat thing about this package is that we can plot the results according to their relationship with metadata. So we can say, for example, we can use this estimate effect function, and here what we're doing is we are going to essentially run a regression model that uses the metadata to predict the topic prevalence, and then we're going to do a bunch of plots with those. And so here's a plot that shows, we've plotted 3 topics here, topic 3, number 5, and topic 9. And here we have this liberal conservative scale that was created via this coder of these original blog posts. And we can look at which topics are more likely to appear on conservative blogs versus liberal blogs, for example, here. Yeah? We can do the same thing with time. So here we've regressed time on our topic prevalence, and we can look at whether a given topic, like which topic is this here, topic number 3, right, and its distribution over time in the blog posts. And here again, we might care about this for our analysis. There might be some interesting puzzle about why, rhetoric about war shifted or something like that we wanted to investigate in our analysis. Or we might be using this to further validate. If we have some knowledge about a topic that maybe only existed for 1 month, and we wanted to somehow know that, we might want to visualize it like this. While we're on the subject of time, though, this is a good example of the power of metadata to improve our topic classification. So let's think about the term war, for example. Or a theme about war. And let's think about looking at a corpus of documents for, say, the entire 20th century. And if we were looking at documents from 1930 1955, 1970, 1985, right? The meaning of the term war would change a lot, right? Not only across the world wars, but then the Vietnam War, of course, but then say the war on drugs, right? Or the war on poverty, right? And the way we use the term, if we're using regular LDA, we're assuming that all of those documents belong in the same soup, right? That we want to make sense of all of them. That you know, the word war, as it was used in 1985, you know, carries the same meaning, or it should have the same meaning when it co-occurs with other words as it did in 1920. If we're using metadata, then we're allowing year to influence the classification of documents, and we may be able to pull out separate topics around war, like the war on drugs versus the world wars, for example. So, you know, if it's the case that natural language use is always changing and that words are always changing according to contextual factors, then, you know, using time alone in a topic model could be very informative. And so I think that's, you know, when people ask, well, which metadata point should you use? I think time is a really good one. There's a danger, though, which is using too many points of metadata to predict topics. So here, for example, in our model, we've been using the liberal and conservative score to predict topic assignment, right? But what if there are cross-cutting topics, and that's something we care about theoretically, right? That which topics bridge conservative liberal blogs, right? Well, if we've maybe, you know, there's a few problems, right? If we've miscoded the political bias of the blog, that's one thing. But we're also really asking the topic model to think, you know, maybe find different topics in the conservative space and the liberal space. And so we've kind of forestalled the identification of potentially overlapping or bridging topics. And so, you know, at a certain point, you know, there's a temptation maybe to throw in the kitchen sink all the metadata you've got, but we need, you know, one needs to think carefully about which type of metadata is going to improve topic classification and which might distort it, which forms might distort it. Okay, so there's a number of additional visualization tools that are described in the STM documentation. One of them is called STM Browser. This is an interactive D3JS style tool for those of you who are familiar with that kind of interactive visualization. So this is a visualization where you can mouse over things and it will reveal data points such as the top terms associated with a topic at a given point in time. And also do check out the LDA Viz package. That is a really neat way of visualizing the distribution of topics across terms in a multi-dimensional space. And there are helper functions that allow you to export topic models from both the LDA package and the STM package into the LDA Viz package that might be worth checking out. Okay, so we're going over time, but we're going to be just fine as long as we take about a 5-minute break, please. So we'll come back at 11:45 and we'll talk about text networks. Thanks. If everyone could please end your conversation so we can start the live, start back up here. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We've gone over a lot today and a lot yesterday. We have one more topic on the agenda today, but I hope you'll find it a really exciting one. We're going to talk about some of the cutting edge of text analysis and some new emerging alternatives to topic modeling. Okay, so we described in the last section a lot of strengths of topic models, right? They can do pretty well in picking out some themes, but there's this great challenge of identifying the number of topics and then of interpreting them, right? And making sense of patterns of word co-occurrence through list of words, right? And so those are big challenges. And the methods of interpretation and validation are themselves, even I think most experts agree, not great. So in text networks, we're not going to find a panacea. This isn't going to be an alternative that solves all those problems. But we may find some alternatives that some people may find more intuitive or compelling by thinking about text as network. So we have a very diverse audience. We have probably both experts in network analysis and people who have scarcely ever analyzed a network. So we'll just take a moment to talk about network analysis and how network analysis can be used to do text analysis. Okay, what is a network? A formal definition of a network is a group of nodes. Here, nodes are these circles. Sometimes they're called vertices or a vertex. And then the set of edges or ties between them, these little lines here. And so very often when we're thinking about a network, networks could be all sorts of things, right? In social science, very often a network is a way of representing relationships between individuals. So let's say we're looking at a group of high school students, and each student is a circle, and the edges between them describe whether or not they count each other as friends. And we see very often when we start to think of the world as a network, groupings, just like we see here. Clustering of people. It's one of the few things that seems to be a near universal property of social relationships is that we see these dense patterns of connections and then these kind of weak ties between them. And without getting too into the specifics of graph analysis, which is of course a huge sprawling field that cuts across many different disciplines, and network science really occurs in everywhere from sociology to physics to even increasingly places like political science, economics. And so we're going to have some strange verbiage here and there. But the key thing that I'm going to try to convince you of today is that just like we can use graph theory to find patterns of groupings among people, we can do the same thing with patterns of groupings among texts or people producing texts. So there's an entire field of techniques or methodologies in network analysis known as community detection. And here, essentially, we're writing very fancy algorithms that look for patterns in the ways that people are connected to each other, often by counting the number of paths one has to take to reach everyone else in a network like this one here. And then, very often we can make pretty good clusterings of people into different groups. Here, they're represented by color, because this is a very clear case where we have three kinds of groupings of people. And there's many different flavors of community detection, and that would produce somewhat different results. But the bet here is that if we think about a text as a network, instead of making a bag of words assumption, where we're throwing all the words in a text into a single bin, shaking it around and kind of seeing what comes out, and then making sense of where words are assigned to topics, here we're going to be able to see the words in this kind of more multidimensional connected space and not only see which words co-occur, but also look for cases of, say, triadic closure. And this is a principle from network analysis where we tend to see that, especially in social groups, where 3 people become connected to each other, we can better identify community structures. And when you think about that, why is that? Well, you may have heard, you know, the old saying, my friend's friend is my friend, right? Or this, my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? And this type of phenomena where any individual relationship or any relationship between 2 individuals can be profoundly shaped by a 3rd individual, right? A common enemy, a love triangle, whatever you want to call it, right? It turns out that the same intuition can be used to think about words. When we think about 2 words co-occurring, whether or not those 2 words co-occur alongside a 3rd word, this principle of triadic closure is something that has become very central to a lot of theorizing in both sociology and literary theory, where a lot of the early origins of this came out of, and also in linguistics with things like WordNet. And so the idea here is broadly that instead of thinking about people as nodes in the network, we're going to think about words as nodes in a network, or we're going to think about people as nodes in a network, but we're going to connect them not through things like their friendships to each other, but by the way they use the same words. And so we're going to be able to do both something that looks like topic modeling when we connect words to each other, but then also something different, a different kind of grouping that might be more conducive to social science when we're out to group not only relationships between words, but relationships between individual actors in the world. Could be people, could be organizations, could be states, and the way that they talk about things. So in order to make this move from bag of words to these networks of words, we're going to have to understand a core distinction in social network theory, and that's the difference between a 1-mode and a 2-mode network. And for the purposes of illustration, we're going to want to think about a group of newspapers and how they are covering an event, okay? So here in the blue squares, we have newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, the Houston Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and so on. And then we have these red nodes, and these red nodes are words that each newspaper used when they covered the moon landing, okay? So many of them used the same word, like moon. Some of them used different words, like collect, rock, land. Others used words like mankind, leap, right? This, of course, was a very, very common phrase from the astronaut who landed on that auspicious day, right? And so this is a representation of 2 kinds of relationships, really. It's a representation of newspapers and how they use words, right? That's what we're seeing here. But we can also use this intuition to connect newspapers to each other, or to connect words to each other. And the way that we're going to do that, so here's it explain. So we're going to go from here to here. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to say, okay, the New York Times and the Boston Globe, if you both use the same word, or if you both use a lot of the same type of word, we're going to give you a tie to each other. And if you use a lot of the same type of word, we're going to make that a stronger tie, a weighted tie. That tie is going to have it's going to be thicker, indicating that there's even more of a similarity between the New York Times and the Boston Globe, right? And so we can do 2 types of projections from this, what's known as a 2-mode network, because we're capturing 2 kinds of relationships, right? We can do a word-to-word projection. So here we're looking at how words clustered on that day. Discourse about the astronaut, discourse about the terminology used, and then, of course, how the newspapers covered the event. Okay? So the key intuition here is that, let's say these were not newspapers, but people. And a very classic example is people and their affiliation with groups that comes out of sociology and Ron Breiger's work. So specifically the notion that if I know a person and I know which groups they belong to, let's say Facebook groups, for example, right? and I don't know how people are related to each other in this hypothetical network, but I want to, that's what I'm out to measure, then I can build a network by looking for patterns and who's affiliated with each group. And even though I don't know that the people in the same group are friends, I could make that assumption and create network structure out of looking for patterns of two people being affiliated with the same group. So the same intuition is going in here. We're linking newspapers, in this case, by their use of shared words, and we're linking words by their usage and different newspapers. So we can do two, they're called projections, when we take a complex data structure like this and make it more simple. We can do it with words here, and we can do it with the authors of words, if you will, here. Any questions so far? There's a lot of different, if you've just encountering network analysis, this may be a new concept. Is there anyone in the live stream who has any questions? Okay, great. Okay, so how do we get from there to, from our text to numbers? Because ultimately, to build these graphs, we need to have some kind of numeric representation of words. There's two articles that have done this recently. I should say, though, that the idea of text networks has been around for some time, maybe 20 years, although it hasn't really been developed a great deal until the last 2 years. I published this paper 2 years ago that uses text networks to try to predict the virality of social media posts. And the idea here is that we can take posts. These are social media posts. You can't really read this, so if you're zooming in, I'm going to walk you through it. Up at the top here, we have 3 Facebook posts produced by 3 different nonprofit groups. This is data that was produced using the app strategy that I described yesterday. And these are people talking about autism spectrum disorders in different ways. If you know this field, you'll know that people have very different views about what causes autism spectrum disorders and so on and so forth. And if we wanted to position these organizations in a manner that describes how they're talking about autism spectrum disorders in different ways, we could take their texts, lemmatize them. That's the pre-processing step that I mentioned earlier that's a slightly more sophisticated form of stemming, or reducing words to their conjugate form. Then calculate the term frequency inverse document frequency, meaning that we are rewarding strange words that appear a lot in one document but not a lot in the whole corpus, using our term frequency inverse document frequency. And then we can create ties between all these organizations producing all these posts that describe the sum of the overlapping terms TF-IDF. So what that means is that we're trying to, here we have 3 organizations and these are ties between them. We're trying to say that organizations that use the same words and organizations that use the same unusual words in particular should have stronger ties to each other. And these thicker ties here are going to help us do our community detection, our ability to cluster these, especially these triads of words that co-occur, or in this case, organizations producing words, in order to find themes or groups of authors that are talking in similar ways, or groups of words that together in these clustered networks cohere into a meaning. There's another really nice example that comes from Elise Rule, Jean-Philippe Conté, and Peter Bierman. And this is, they do an analysis of the State of the Union addresses. We're actually going to reproduce some of their analysis in a few minutes here. And what they're doing here is they're taking the State of the Union address, which is a US address that each president makes each year to describe current affairs and what the president thinks should be done about them. And so it's a nice data set and popular in the natural language processing community because it's not too long, and but it contains a real diverse set of discussions. And what they've done in this visual here is plot words that co-occur in these documents. So each node is a word, and each edge is the co-occurrence of that word across a State of the Union address. And remember that there are multiple observations for multiple presidents, so each president might have 4 addresses or 8 addresses, depending on how long they were in office. And so what you can see if you zoom in here is that Here we've got the Louvain community detection algorithm applied to this network. That is a particular algorithm that looks again for patterns in the triadic closure and the minimizing the path length or the distance between the edges, looking for essentially groupings of text, right? We see very clear patternings of the words into things you might call topics or themes, such as the Navy, political economy, land, production, domestic policy, foreign policy, crime, statecraft, and so on, right? And so what's nice about this, right, we didn't make any assumptions about K, about the number of topics, right? The Louvain algorithm actually does that for us, which is nice. It's not perfect. Again, just like the goodness of fit measures I talked about earlier, it's at the end looking for patterns of connections, but these patterns of connections are not being driven by arbitrary groupings of words within documents, but we're able to see precisely how not only any two words co-occur in the documents, but how whole clusters of words cohere. So in other words, we immediately see the whole corpus, or most of the corpus, depending on how we visualized it. And this makes interpretation a lot easier. Yeah, we can get a better sense of whether or not there's real signal in our categorization. Okay. Another nice thing about this is, though we could use the structural topic model to get at time, this approach also allows time to be emergent in the classification. So here we have communities that are populated across time, across the State of the Union addresses, and we can look at themes emerge and combine into each other, right? And this is because the dynamic nature of network analysis, right? We can allow for words to co-occur at one period, but then co-occur differently at another period, right? Allows us to look at dynamic shifts in word usage. In this case, looking at shifts in discourse about especially negotiation, arms, the people, the treasury, and how other themes of political debate emerged out of those. So again, it's kind of a nice way of recognizing language as we know it, right? We don't usually think about themes as emerging just through a list of words. We as humans detect meaning more often by looking at clusters of words and thinking in terms of triadic relationships between words. So, yes, yeah, of course.
I'm no expert on networks at all, but I was wondering the words in the graph on the previous slide, can they end up in different parts of the network, or is one word end up at one location and not any other?
So there's one way of answering that question, which is about the position in the figure. I don't think that's what you're asking, but just in case that's what you're asking, the layout or the way in which the nodes are arranged in this multidimensional space is determined by an algorithm. This one, I believe, is called the Fruchterman-Reingold algorithm, but there's many others like Kamada-Kawai, circle layouts. There's many different ways of positioning the nodes according to their adjacency with other nodes. But I think your question was really about, how does can one word only belong to one network, or does it potentially belong to multiple networks? Here's another advantage of text networks, right? Let's look at a word like attack right here, right? It's actually in between our foreign policy community and our crime community, right? Our community detection algorithm will arbitrarily lump it into one of those two things. But with a projection here, we can actually see that it's really in between two topics, right? We could kind of do that with topic modeling. Maybe if we looked at, we did some kind of like Herfindahl style index across topic probabilities and looked at words that had, a high index suggesting they were distributed evenly across a lot of topics. But even if we did that, we wouldn't know exactly which topics they were being linked to and how. And this is just a really simple and I think intuitive way of finding words that are bridging, that may have an important meaning. So the term attack here, and of course it's in between foreign policy and crime, which tells us that this is one of these words that really pivots across the two categories. Yeah. I think there's another question. Yeah.
how do you determine whether there's an edge between two words? I imagine that you would need some kind of cutoff, right?
Yes.
Criterion. So, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how it is different to choosing arbitrarily having to choose a number of topics as to arbitrarily having to choose a cutoff for these edges.
I'll get to that particular topic in just a second, but a brief answer is there's no, again, this is no panacea. That is a non-arbitrary decision. But one of the ways that we handle it, which is arguably more informative, is to simulate random networks and then to compare our observed network to that random network and delete edges that wouldn't have occurred according to randomness. Just a shout out to Ryan for recommending that technique to us some time ago. But yeah, I'll get to that in just a second. But again, it is somewhat arbitrary, right? Because at the end, it's not a perfect decision. But the bet is that once we look at it, right, we're seeing what's driving the classification in an arguably more informative way. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah.
So like in these political speeches, and I guess other speeches, other document, usually there's like the speaker would cite to other people. So is there a way, is there a way to capture, I guess, the purpose of the citation, right? It could be to criticize, it could be to support, it could be for multiple purposes. And I guess you could do like a sentiment analysis. Is that the way to do it?
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, that's exactly where we're going. We don't have it built into the package that I'm about to show you, but we're just working on exactly that issue. I'll talk about exactly that, applying sentiment analysis to this technique at the very end of this lecture. So it's a great idea. The neat thing is, very often we have social network data. So in the example you're describing, like we know how people are connected, like let's say political parties or something like that. And then we can overlay on top of that political relationship their discursive relationships, right? And then, for example, if we wanted to recast the study of political polarization, we might think of people as people who are in one party but able to speak in the language of another party, right? We can identify those types of people, or those types of, or maybe you're more simply out to identify unusual documents that were influential in bridging multiple communities. That's something I discuss in the aforementioned paper, combining natural language processing and social network analysis to look at in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
A quick follow-up, does it also capture the sentiment of ambivalence? That's very often one of the key.
So we're only as good as our sentiment classifier. And as we discussed in the earlier lecture on dictionary-based analyses, sentiment analysis is an imperfect tool. Yeah, but what we're going to do in a few minutes is combine sentiment analysis with part-of-speech tagging and pick up some of the syntactic relationships between words embedded in sentences to at least connect the word to the object that it's meant to modify to try to do a little better than we would if we just applied sentiment analysis to a whole sentence. Yeah, Doug.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my question has to do with whether or not there are standard ways of measuring the extent to which a word is a boundary case. So because these community partitions are probabilistic,
yes.
I mean, if you were to rerun it a bunch of times,
yes.
can you get a measure of which words flip the most? Is there like methods for that?
That would be an interesting way to do it. I mean, that's a little more sophisticated than the way that we've done it so far, which is just to calculate something like a betweenness centrality or some other kind of brokerage measure for those of you who are knowledgeable about social network analysis. But that would be a really interesting way to do it. It would be something similar to doing the goodness of fit measures from specifying K, right? If we reran the community detection 30 times and found the same partition 90% of the time, then maybe we're happy with that partition, yeah. And there's, of course, some community detection algorithms that do that, right? They just take a long time to run. And there's some limitations because we're working with weighted networks here, and so not all community detection algorithms can run on weighted networks. Right now, in the current implementation of this technique, we use Louvain, but we've also had good experiences with the spin glass community detection algorithm, which could be easily implemented in our package that I'm about to describe, but we haven't done it yet. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah.
The thought of that method had come from some of the stuff in network neuroscience where they will ask, in this given context, how often is this brain region activated in this task?
Right.
And then when you go task to task, which brain regions turn off and actually.
Exactly, yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I would love for someone to talk to me later about doing that study. Yeah. Yeah. I should say, this is a very new method, so that these type of things we're still working out. But it's a great idea. Okay, other questions? Okay. Okay, so to implement text networks, we've created a package called TextNets. A few of us here at Duke. And it uses a lot of the tools that we've been talking about today to build text networks. It has tools for preparing text for network analysis, doing all that prepping that just like we had in this STM package. It will create the text network, go from words to numbers, creating something called an adjacency matrix, which is necessary to produce a network visualization. It has a series of tools for network visualization, both static network plots like we've been looking at, and also interactive plots where you can mouse over nodes and see which words are driving classification or which authors are being grouped together. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And finally, it has tools for detecting the words and themes that are driving the classification and groupings. So similar to the layout of the structural topic modeling package, which again is just a great package that covers so much and is really well supported by Brandon Stewart. Okay. So to install the package, you'll need the DevTools package. It's currently living on GitHub. And a word of warning, it has a lot of dependencies, so it takes a while to install. It uses a lot of large packages for things like part-of-speech tagging and working with large matrices. You'll also, unfortunately, need a very recent version of R. I slacked this to everyone this morning. One of the dependencies in our part-of-speech tagger requires R 3.5. So you will either need to go to the CRAN website and download a new version of R if you want to try this, or you can use the update R package, which I believe is also hosted on GitHub, which allows you to automatically update to the most current version of R. Okay. And by the way, there's a README on our GitHub, on my GitHub, sorry, produced by several of us here that will work you through a worked example with the State of the Union data that we're about to look at. That is also in the annotated code that is linked on the Summer Institute's website. Okay, so in our package, we attached or included the State of the Union data. And so this should be in quotes here. If you write data and then open and close quotes, SOTU for State of the Union, then it should open up a data frame that has all of the State of the Union addresses for all presidents, I think, up to Obama. One of the downsides of our technique is that part-of-speech tagging takes a bit of time. So this is a database that only has about 200 authors, but because they're really long texts, they're maybe a half hour, an hour long, our code has to go through each sentence and break it into its parts of speech because we add the option of using noun phrases, noun compounds to tokenize, right? And so in the interest of time, our example is just with the first speech by each president rather than all 4 or all 8 of them. And although it doesn't take that long to run on all of them, it might take 10 or 20 minutes. It's roughly equivalent to the time it might take to do topic modeling, and much faster if you're looking at tweets. And while we're on the subject of tweets, one of the things we didn't talk about when we talked about topic modeling was some of the limitations around sample size. So typically speaking, running topic models on corpuses that are smaller than 800 documents produces very poor quality classifications. Also, running topic models on very short texts, such as tweets or social media posts, also typically produces fairly bad classifications in my experience. TextNets has no limitations in terms of sample size or document size. Obviously, the longer the document, the more accurate the classification becomes, just like topic modeling, but it can be used on corpuses of any size. Okay, so this text, this prep text function is going to read in a data frame that has a text variable in it. We have to specify the text variable. Here it's called so2text. That's a variable in this data frame. Then remember we can either do a word-to-word projection or an author-to-author projection. Here we're going to create a projection of the presidents to each other. So the presidents are going to be linked in our network based on how many similar words they use. We have another of different options. We're going to tokenize by words. We have options to tokenize tweets, which is kind of nice with hashtags and things like that. We're only going to look at nouns. So here's where we could look at compound nouns or verbs or adjectives or anything we wanted to look at. And some folks here have done some interesting work with verbs. And I think, Jeff, you've done some of that work, right? And we're removing stop words. And we're keeping compound nouns. And we're going to save a file here, just because we might want to rerun it a few different ways. And so here we're creating what we're doing under the hood is creating a tidy text data frame where we only have nouns and noun compounds, and we don't have stop words. And so you can imagine a president, a noun, a president, a noun phrase, a president, a noun, and so on and so forth. And we're going to use that, pass that to the next function called createTextNet, which is going to take that tidy text object and transform it into a network object called in R iGraph. And there's also an iGraph module in Python if you're familiar with network analysis in Python. And once we have a iGraph object here called so2textNetwork, we gave it a new name now in this stage, then we can visualize the text. The visTextNet function is going to read in that text network. It has a parameter that we've specified here called label degree cut. So if you have a really noisy network with a lot of different people and you only want to visualize the people who have a lot of connections, for example, you can specify the degree. Degree is a measure of the number of connections each person or each word has. And then you can only visualize the labels of. Here we've labeled everyone, and so we've set that to 0. To Karsten's earlier question, right? Because everybody would use a really common word like United States, everybody would have a tie to each other. And so if we just plotted the whole network, we would see a giant hairball, right? It wouldn't be very informative at all. Now, remember, though, that we're using TF-IDF, so we are penalizing really common phrases like United States, and we are rewarding really strange terms, right, that may be characteristic of a particular president. But at the same time, even after, and topic modeling does that, as we discussed earlier, we're still going to wind up with a hairball. So here, underneath the hood, the visTextNet package is using something called a disparity filter, which is what I mentioned earlier. We're simulating random networks, and then we're comparing the random network to our observed network and keeping those nodes that who have appeared purely according to chance. And that's localized for each node. There are other alternatives like K-core connectivity, but we found in recent testing this is working really nicely. So here you can see the patterns of co-word usage by the presidents. And what's really nice here is you can see almost perfectly picked up time. So down here we have Obama, Bush, Ford, Carter, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy, and back up here, Grant, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and of course, movement through the 19th and 20th century here. Particularly in very dense networks, this type of static visualization can be constraining. And so the TextNets package also has an alternative called visTextNet D3. And this creates an interactive visualization in your RStudio pane, in the viewer pane, that looks like this. And you can drag over individual nodes in order to reveal the name of the author of the document. Or if you're doing a word-to-word projection, you can mouse over to look at which words are driving the classification. And if you'd like to save these HTMLs, you can come back to our slides here. Using the HTML widgets function, you can use the save widget function and specify the name of an HTML file you'd like to save. And of course, these could be embedded in presentations or our pres scripts and so on and so forth. Now, one of the complications, so earlier Carson had the good intuition that just as topic modeling has a problem with identifying K, the number of topics, we still need a number to specify at which point we're going to prune the ties that didn't occur according to randomness. We have a tuning parameter called alpha here, and alpha by default is set to 0.25, and that's how we get this nice projection. But if we turn up the criterion, make it harder for someone to have an edge, we wind up trimming nodes, right? We don't see all the presidents here, and we wind up with a less informative network. So there is a kind of balancing act of finding that sweet spot for alpha, and we haven't yet done benchmarking to do that, and that would be a great next step for anyone who wanted to take it. To analyze these text networks, we can run our Louvain community detection on the network, and then look at the groupings of presidents. So here we see modularity class, which is the cluster. You can think of it as the clustering. And of course, as Doug mentioned, we could use a probabilistic grouping or probabilistic community detection assignment. So here you're seeing old and new presidents grouped. And we can do the same thing with the words. So this is just analogous to the topic modeling, right? Earlier we looked at which words occur in which topics and which documents occur in which documents. We're doing the same thing here. And so here we're seeing how different types of themes occur in different modularity classes. Modularity classes are, again, groups or clusters of patterns in our network. We can also calculate the centrality of given words or given authors in our network. In the aforementioned paper, my 2016 paper, I show that the centrality of an actor in this cultural network, if you will, is strongly associated with the virality of their social media posts, accounting for all the other confounding factors we talked about yesterday. So, okay, finally in the last few minutes here, so there's some exciting next steps that we're taking. So now that we've got the parts of speech tagged, right? We've been, in these examples, just looking at nouns and noun compounds, and we talked about how that's maybe an improvement over tokenizing by words or unigrams. But we can go a lot further, because part of speech tagging not only tells us the parts of speech, but we can also use sentence parsing to identify the dependencies of words upon each other. So we can know which word in a sentence modifies which other word. So our example, I hate the president versus I'd hate to be the president, right? We can, through sentence parsing, pull out the part of the sentence that we care about, right? In this case, president, and then pull out the adverb modifier, and then run a sentiment analysis on that adverb modifier. And to May's earlier question, that allows us to then either create a valued edge, so we can say two people agree about most things or they disagree about most things, depending on whether their shared sentiment around an object is either positive or negative. Or we can look globally, we can treat each person as a vector of opinions across all different nouns or objects or named entities they might talk about, and then calculate some type of dissimilarity score between them, rewarding or making stronger ties between people who talk about the same topics in the same way, and penalizing people who talk about the same topics in different ways, and deleting edges between them. Yeah? So here we have a toy example where the authors here are all talking about a series of silly things, and we're drawing edges between us here as a proof of concept. And now, just last week, we've been applying this to Twitter discourse that we collected in the other study, the bot-based study that we described yesterday. And here, this is a plot that by Fridolin Merhut that shows really interesting patterning according to our valued networks. Or these are here dissimilarity between words based upon this combination of sentence parsing, part of speech tagging, sentiment analysis, and network analysis. And so if anyone is interested, we're very much looking for collaborators, people who might want to apply it to their own corpus or suggest improvements. And some have already been suggested here today, which we'd love to follow up with you on. We're almost out of time, so I think I better pause for questions here or on the live stream. Anything? Carson?
Cool package.
Thank you.
Did you consider also using named entity recognition for stuff within texts?
It's a great idea. We find that a lot of those get picked up as noun compounds, but in an earlier version of the package, we used phrase machine, which uses more sophisticated type of named entity recognition. The problem we were having is that it has these weird Java dependencies that make it difficult for people to use. And we found that in most cases, people were doing okay with noun compounds. But it could be easily tweaked to incorporate named entities. And that would be great, because you could then start to infer social relationships from text data at a more sophisticated level. Maybe that's where you were going with that suggestion.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, so maybe in the future it would be possible to, for example, specify the backend for text parsing so that you could not only have UDPipe for example, Spacey, and Python dependencies are working much better than Java dependencies, in my opinion.
Yes,
And this might be a solution.
Absolutely. We've been impressed by UDPipe. I agree, Spacey, when we installed a Python backend for Spacey, we saw better results as well than the Java results. But check out UDPipe. The nice thing is it allows support for multiple languages too. It's another advantage of our package, we think, is you can specify the language, any language that's supported by UDPipe, and I think there's, about a dozen, Frito, or some? Six, okay, well. 16, oh, even better, okay. 6D, whoa, okay, wow, all right. So not bad, yeah? And that's another advantage, right, of thinking through this technique, is maybe it's more portable to other languages, yeah. Human languages, that is, yeah. Python, who knows, yeah. Someone write the Python module, yeah. Okay, any other questions? We should probably wrap up, we're out of time, but I have a few announcements. The first is, tonight at 4 p.m., there are we don't have a speaker here at Duke, but there are two great speakers, one of whom I mentioned earlier, which is Ned Smith at Kellogg, who's doing really interesting work at the intersection of social psychology, social network analysis. And the other is Arthur Sperling, who's a political scientist who's been at the frontier of text analysis. He's at NYU. He's talking at the NYU stream tonight. Unfortunately, they're both talking at the same time at 4 p.m. And of course, here again, tomorrow we'll have David Lazar, and then on Friday, Sendel Melanathan, and then next week, Dean Freewan, Christian Lum, and Monica Lee. Okay? So the group exercise is posted on the GitHub. The exercise is essentially to, once again, break into small groups, but this time the idea is to take the Trump tweet corpus that I've been playing with today, identify themes in it using one of the techniques, and then see whether you can build a model that predicts the number of retweets or the number of likes of those tweets based upon properties of the text or other things that are in that data. There's a number of other metadata variables that may be of interest. Okay? So I'll see you back here at 1:30. And unlike yesterday, we will do a brief presentation of your model, ideally in